So, it's learning to be in community with each other. And as you look at candidates, we have to look at this quality. And we have the examples in the early church all over the map in terms of how they dealt with the issue of division. Our grand narrative in the 1 Corinthians passage is there for us all to see, and that Paul's great problem was the divisions that he was facing in the church that he started in many ways. And in this first chapter, he says that there in Christ be no divisions among you, that there be agreement. And Christ is not divided. For Christ did not send him to baptize even, but to proclaim the gospel. And that gospel is about unity of the church. I was very struck by Jan Love's comment on this in terms of the 1 Corinthians passage when she said, their commitment to Jesus Christ was so strong, you can't be kicked out of the community, nor could you voluntarily leave. And that's a great example of what I believe. I don't want to be kicked out, nor do I want to voluntarily leave. This is the truth of our gospel stance. And perhaps our task is to keep broadening our horizons, this perspective to become the new creature in Christ Jesus that Paul so desperately wants for the people. To become that transformed mind and spirit that's comfortable with total opposites, that perhaps that's the key to a competency that we need to look for in our candidates and in our clergy and our laity. The social psychologist from Harvard, Robert Keegan, has done extensive work in this area, and he provides the best research that I know of in this template of how we may progress in human mind and identity. And he does that in 3 phases. The first phase, of course, is the socialized mind, where we are shaped directly by our environment and is really expressed in our schools of thought, that we were raised and educated in an ethos, and for us, the American ethos, which is very, very much a distinct ethos for all the world. But you are also a product of your education. So those of you who are educated at certain theological schools have this kind of principles that you sort of orient around. But he said that's not good enough, that we must move to the self-authoring mind, which is to step back from that where you've been raised and what you've gained from your environment, and to generate this internal seat of judgment that makes its own choices. And then to develop a belief system that takes stands, that is self-directed, that sets boundaries and limits. And to find our own voice is that middle stage. But he said that's not still good enough, because the final stage for him is the self-transforming mind, where we once again step back, reflect on the limits of our own ideologies and personal authorities and identities, and see that any one system or self-organization is partial and incomplete. Be friendlier to the contradictions and opposites, and seek to hold on to multiple systems rather than projecting all on one particular way of thought. What it means is embracing the whole, appreciating the opposites that are dialectical, and looking for that greater truth. So it is the F. Scott Fitzgerald quote, which many people are accessing now, is remember the two opposing minds or ideas that you can hold completely together in your own mind and still retain the ability to function. And then that part of the quote that he doesn't, sometimes people don't use, and that is, when things seemingly are hopeless, we are determined to make it otherwise. That's our task. Let me show you a film clip. This is from Gandhi, the movie Gandhi. And it is during Gandhi's life-threatening protest fast. And he has brokered a peace, the end of a violent response from the anti-Muslim group. And the title, of course, is How to Get Out of Hell. So let me share this with you. The power of film and that illustration, I don't think we have to say any more about this issue of retaining two opposites, or the whole expansion of a greater place with God. So to finish up today, this is actually a teaser to the next segment. We're going to break into groups, but to let you sort of chew on a few things, and that is, we now face a situation where we have to reset our ministry agenda, all of us. That's not only our candidates, it's all of us here. All of the paradigms and systems that we've crafted for our United Methodist Church are for a bygone era. And the culture has forced us to change, so that the whole movement from an attractional to a missional model has to be factored into this. And the attractional model, which is our heritage, focused on buildings and institutions, highlighted the program model of which we've been trained in seminary, and had the old paradigm of the therapeutic model, which was individualistic, professional, and consumeristic. And we now find ourselves clearly in a missional stage, going back to our roots, as Randy had mentioned to us the first day, beyond buildings and institutions and directly to the mission field, returning to discipling models and DNA, and a dynamic mission of outreach rather than in-house programming. But we, in this hybrid time, are one step in the attractional model and hopefully one step out. And if we're two steps, we're totally planted in the attractional model, we're in real trouble, folks, because we've got to move to the hybrid. And the hybrid is have both, and hence my emphasis on the polar opposites. Hybrids allow for the greatest avenue for innovation and experimentation. So this is the time that we figure this out in a hybrid way as we move from one transition to the next. What can we jettison? What do we need to leave behind? And what do we need to retain? The adaptive folks, Heifetz and Linsky, talk often about this in change. And what they point out is that the DNA difference between a chimpanzee and humanity is in percentage points. Heifetz says 99%, but actually in research, it's probably about between 96 and 97% of our DNA is the same as a chimpanzee. Well, 4% made all the difference in the world in an evolutionary sense. What 4% would leverage the church the greatest and make the greatest difference in changing our dynamic to something evolutionarily brilliant and complex and life-changing for the church itself? That's what we've got to figure out. That's why all of you are here. So, our expectation of the clergy must change completely. And I'm not going to even go through this because I want to get you time, but let me close with this last cartoon. This is a Gary Larson cartoon. And it's the real reasons dinosaurs became extinct is they're smoking. Now, we all know that the theory, the latest theory, of course, and the accepted one, is that a huge asteroid hit the Earth and really developed this nuclear environmental winter. And so it obscured the sun, put so much dust in the air that the large species could not survive. And they did not have vegetation. And so they died because of their huge biological frameworks that could not survive this environmental disaster. Well, you see the parallels, folks. We've got this huge bureaucratic structure called the United Methodist Church that is unwieldy at this point. And this asteroid has hit us already in the cultural changes that we're facing. And the question is, how are we going to survive it? It's not through too large to fail. It's going to be in small, incremental movements that all of you represent in your settings, and a return back to the mission fields that all of you are serving to innovate and experiment and figure out a way forward in the light of the environmental change that we have. So, we want you to break into your groups at this point. I'm going to give you a full 20 minutes. What is your present context? What does your annual conference need the most right now? What is your biggest constraint and problem? And what do you need to prioritize the most in light of the great cultural change that you face? So you don't have to go through these questions, by the way. You may forge your own. But the first step is for cabinets and boards to start talking about a collaboration, which I'll tackle next in the next segment. But please, for the next 20 minutes, just gather at your table. If you don't have a table, go find one that you can relate to and be a part of. And if you're a small conference, 2 conferences can get together, by the way, representatively here. Okay? So go at it. You got 20 minutes to get going. There we go. Okay. Now, here's a systemic constraint for us, and that is the book of discipline. I wanted a way to somewhat illustrate that the Board of Ordained Ministry has 4.5 pages in the book of discipline, single-spaced at 11 font, numbered font. It just goes on and on and on. And I had my communicator, who's a postmodern layperson with an MDiv. This was his humor on the book of discipline. So we're not going to do the whole thing, but this is his way of dealing with it. But seriously, there's just so much there, and you all know this, whom I think one of the most astute disciplinary or book of discipline experts we have come from the Board of Ordained Ministry. So you know the literature and how so massive it is. It's a product of our runaway legislative process that is perhaps something we need to jettison to look to the new. Yeah, I'm serious. So my hope would be in Portland we could throw out the book of discipline and start over, but if I were king, geez. Unfortunately, I doubt if that's going to happen. But I hearken back to Steve Jobs, though, on this one. Now, interesting enough, Jobs broke all the rules of leadership, all the rules of leadership models. He broke all of them. He had very little emotional intelligence. He was a command and control leader. He was egocentric to the max. He's an egomaniac in some ways. And those of you who've read Isaacson's biography of Job sees, it just broke every leadership rule in some ways. But he was also a genius and very charismatic. And through the force of his personality alone, he brought Apple back from the brink of the John Sculley era, where it was the epitome of the maintenance mindset in Sculley. And Jobs was the one who redirected them back into something very dynamic. So here's an example. One thing about Jobs is his simplicity, his clarity, and his focus. Those were his success tools. And what he did every year was he invited maybe 100 people to a planning retreat. And at Apple, you knew you were in if you got an invitation to this one event, which Jobs himself led. And they'd go through a week of visioning and projecting new directions and inventions. And then at the end of the retreat, Jobs would stand at his famous whiteboard, and he'd write down a maximum of 10 to 12 new ideas that were really compelling by the body that came there. And then, typical Jobs, he'd take his marker and he'd cross out all the ones he didn't think were made it up to snuff. And he'd come up with 3. Maximum of 3. And then he'd tell the crowd, these are the 3 that we're going to work on this next year. Period. All the rest of them were off the table. So really, this sense of clarity and direction were where he centered it. And since his death, if you go to Apple now, you realize that they're getting outside that sort of ethos, that sort of value system in their display of what they have available now. So I'm really wondering if Apple's going to survive the post-Jobs era. Now, for us, we're centered around a central mission. And we put this up on the website. By the way, some of you wanted to know about these PowerPoint presentations. Certainly nothing new, so half of you probably don't care, but some of you wanted them. We'll try to upload them to the event site in a PDF form so that you'll have the information available. But you'll have this one. So if, what I tried to do, the Gallup folks do a really good job in trying to focus mission, and I sort of adapted our mission from their sequence here. And so you could print this whole thing out if you wanted on the website, the event website. But basically, it must start with our personal mission and purpose. So in the bottom of this chart, I would like you to put in what is your personal mission and purpose in life. And that's, it's an exercise that you do at these workshops that you go to, but it really is helpful, and I'll explain more as we go along. But your present context in purple is where you are. And I think in the local church, the individual is below that, and then the local church is the next category. There are two things we're thinking are very dynamic in experimentation and direction and resetting our agenda, and that's making disciples and mission field engagement. Those two have to happen at the local level. But then you have this middle ground, which is both the local church and the larger whole, which is bringing people to Christ. And the ones that we highlighted were young people, ethnic people, and new people, secular people. And what the church has determined that the best way to do this is to go through creating vital congregations. Now, I know it's a little controversial because some of us don't buy in hook, line, and sinker to that particular sub-goal or objective, but it is what the denomination has determined at this point, creating vital congregations. And there is this sense of life that will emerge in our vital congregations if we do this. If we could expand this to new faith communities, whatever form they are, then I'm right with this concept. But it really does mean we have to look to sustainable growth. Sustainable growth. And that's both the local church and the denomination as a whole. All of us representing the annual conferences in many ways. These are the priorities that are set before us. So then we have the final level, which is the general church and really the ecumenical church and the global church, and that is at annual conference level, at general conference level, at jurisdictional level. We have our main mission statement, which is making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. 4 focus areas as an extension of that. It's very clear we have marching orders from the top. We know what our purpose is. And I think that this mission statement has served us well and still may be relevant, but perhaps the next stage is for us to discern what is God's next mission and purpose for us. And I think it's time for us to start thinking of a new mission statement that will be as successful as this one, but will galvanize the denomination to a future. And that's going to only take place with discernment, prayer, and that deep presence of God. So that's a vision for you all. Maybe you have one. We need to start talking about that for the denomination. This has served us well, but perhaps now it's time for us to have a new general mission statement for the church. And going into 2016 General Conference, that will be the place that it will be vetted. So I think this is time for us to start looking at that.